It was difficult for Elena to believe in love stories with tragic endings until she found the locket buried beneath the earth. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more intriguing stories like this. Elena Carter sat in the passenger seat of the taxi, staring out the window as the narrow country road twisted and turned through dense woodland. The trees stretched high, their branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers reaching for each other. It had been a long drive from the city, and exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but there was no turning back now. Ravenglen Manor. The name had sounded almost mythical when she first heard it, an old, sprawling estate that she had inherited from a distant greatman she barely knew. When the lawyer contacted her, she had assumed it was some sort of mistake. She had no memory of ever visiting such a place, and yet, here she was, heading toward a house that was now legally hers. The driver cleared his throat. "Not many folks come out this way," he said, breaking the silence. "That house has been empty for a long time." Elena glanced at him. "Do you know anything about it?" He hesitated, as if considering whether or not to speak. "Just stories. Some folks say the place is haunted. But you know how small towns are, people like to talk." "Haunted?" "Of course. There was always a story like that attached to old houses." She gave a small, tired smile. "Well, I guess I'll find out for myself." The taxi pulled up to the wrought iron gates, rusted and tangled with ivy. Beyond them, the manor loomed, dark stone walls, tall windows with heavy wooden shutters, and a sloping roof that disappeared behind overgrown trees. The front yard was in complete disrepair. Weeds crept through cracks in the stone path, and the once grand fountain in the center was now nothing more than a dry, moss-covered relic. Elena paid the driver, stepped out of the car, and pushed the gate open with some effort. The hinges groaned in protest. As she made her way toward the front door, she felt the weight of the place settle around her. The air smelled of damp earth, old wood, and something faintly floral, like roses, long past their prime. With a deep breath, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust clung to every surface. The air was thick with the scent of aged books, faded fabric, and time itself. The grand staircase curved upward to the second floor, its wooden banister smooth beneath her fingers as she ran her hand over it. Along the walls, old portraits watched her, their painted eyes following her every move. She moved cautiously from room to room, a library filled with books that hadn't been touched in decades, a sitting room with an ancient grand piano covered in a fine layer of dust, and a dining room where the long wooden table was still set for a meal that had never been eaten. It was eerie, but not in the way she expected. The house didn't feel haunted by ghosts. It felt haunted by absence. As if the people who had once lived here had simply vanished, leaving everything exactly as it was. In the study, she found the letters. They were stacked neatly in a wooden box on the desk, the paper yellowed with age. Each envelope was addressed to the same name, Lillian Hawthorne. The handwriting was delicate, precise. As she picked up the top letter and carefully unfolded it, the words inside made her pause. "I waited for you by the garden gate, but you never came. Did you change your mind, or did something stop you? I need to know. Please, if you can, leave me a sign." Elena frowned, a shiver running down her spine. The letter was dated nearly 70 years ago. What had happened here? And more importantly, why did it feel like the house was waiting for her to find out? The following morning, Elena stepped outside into the overgrown backyard. A layer of mist clung to the ground, curling around her ankles as she moved deeper into the tangled wilderness that had once been a carefully cultivated garden. Nature had long since reclaimed this place. Vines choked the stone pathways, wild ivy clung to the outer walls of the house, and thorny brambles reached out like grasping hands. A once beautiful marble fountain stood dry and cracked at the garden's center, its cherubic statue worn down by time. But it was the iron gate she noticed most. At first, it was nearly invisible, swallowed by a curtain of thick ivy, but as she pushed away the greenery, the rusted bars revealed themselves. The gate was tall and arched, its ironwork intricate and elegant despite years of neglect. A small plaque had been affixed above it, dulled with age, but still legible. For those who remember. Elena frowned, brushing her fingers against the rusted surface. The gate was locked. No amount of pushing or pulling would budge it, and no obvious keyhole was visible. What lay beyond it? As she stood there, the morning light cast strange shadows through the trees. A flicker of movement at the corner of her vision made her turn, but there was nothing there, only the whisper of leaves rustling in the breeze. She exhaled and stepped back. If she wanted answers, she needed to find the key. Returning inside, she made her way back to the study, determined to search every drawer, every cabinet, for something that might unlock the gate. The desk was cluttered with old documents, ink bottles, and faded letters, but no key. Frustrated, she turned her attention to a small wooden chest sitting beneath one of the bookshelves. The chest creaked as she opened it. Inside were various belongings, photographs, delicate lace gloves, and a bundle of aged fabric that smelled faintly of lavender. Beneath these items, something caught her eye. An old, leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with gold lettering, the name Lillian Hawthorne barely visible under a layer of dust. Elena's pulse quickened. She flipped to the first page, the ink faded but still readable. The garden has always been my sanctuary. When I am there, I am free. It is the only place where I can be myself. She turned the page. Eleanor and I met beneath the willow tree today. She looked so beautiful in the afternoon light. I fear the world will never understand us, but in the garden, we are safe. No one can reach us here. Elena swallowed hard. Eleanor. The name hadn't appeared in any of the letters she had found so far. She continued reading. We made a promise tonight, under the stars. This garden belongs to us, and no matter what happens, it will always hold our secret. Her fingers trembled as she turned another page, but the writing grew frantic, desperate. I don't understand. She was supposed to meet me. She said she would come. Did something happen? Or did she choose another life? The final entry was short. The ink had smudged, as if it had been written with unsteady hands. I buried my heart here. If you ever find this, know that love once lived within these walls. Elena stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle deep in her chest. Whatever had happened between Lillian and Eleanor, this garden held their story. And she was going to find it. That afternoon, with the journal tucked securely under her arm, Elena resumed her work in the garden. She pulled at the vines, cleared the brush, and uncovered remnants of a life that had been forgotten. Beneath layers of dirt, she found the outline of an old stone pathway leading toward the locked gate. Faded roses, long past their bloom, lined the path in neat rows. Then, as she dug near the base of a tree, her fingers scraped against something solid. A small, rusted metal box lay buried beneath the soil. Her heart pounded as she pulled it free and brushed away the dirt. The box was old, its hinges stiff with rust, but after some effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside was a key, its metal darkened with age, and a folded black and white photograph. She lifted the photograph carefully. It was faded and creased, but the image was still clear enough to see. Two women stood side by side in the garden. One of them was Lillian, unmistakably recognizable from the portraits inside the house. The other woman, Eleanor, smiled beside her, their hands nearly touching. On the back of the photo, a handwritten note read, "We were never meant to be, but this garden was ours." Elena exhaled shakily. She had found the key, and now she would unlock the garden's final secret. The iron key felt cold and heavy in Elena's palm as she stood before the rusted gate. The weight of it wasn't just physical, it was a key to a past long buried, a history that had remained locked away for decades. Taking a steadying breath, she slid the key into the corroded lock. It resisted at first, as if time itself had fused it shut, but with a final twist and a sharp metallic click, the gate creaked open. A rush of cool air brushed past her, carrying the scent of damp earth and faded roses. The space beyond was different from the rest of the overgrown yard, more enclosed, untouched by the outside world. The branches of 2 towering willows arched overhead, their delicate tendrils swaying as though whispering to each other. At the heart of the hidden garden stood a small stone monument, its surface cracked but still sturdy. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an old marker, but when Elena brushed away the dirt, her breath caught. Carved into the stone were 2 letters. LH. Lillian Hawthorne. A sense of finality settled over her, though she didn't yet understand why. Why was there a memorial stone here? Why had Lillian written about burying her heart? She knew she needed answers. The local historical society was housed in a small, red brick building near the town center. Inside, the scent of old books and paper filled the air, and the elderly librarian behind the desk looked up with quiet curiosity as Elena approached. "I'm looking for information about someone who lived in Ravenglen Manor a long time ago," she said, placing the photograph she had found on the counter. Lillian Hawthorne. The librarian's gaze flickered over the image before recognition dawned in her eyes. "You're the one who inherited the estate," she murmured, a hint of something unreadable in her voice. It's been a long time since anyone mentioned Lillian Hawthorne. Elena leaned forward. "Do you know what happened to her?" The librarian hesitated before nodding toward the rows of archived newspapers. "There were rumors," she said carefully. "A scandal back in the late 1950s. Not many people talk about it anymore." Elena spent the next 2 hours sifting through brittle newspaper clippings and town records, piecing together a story that had been deliberately left untold. Lillian Hawthorne had been a woman of means, raised in privilege, and expected to marry well. But there had never been a mention of a husband in any of the records, only an engagement that had mysteriously ended before the wedding. Then, buried in a column of town gossip from 1954, she found it. Rumors continued to circulate regarding the Hawthorne family's youngest daughter, Lillian, who recently called off her engagement to a prominent businessman. Some say the reason is tied to an unnamed companion, a woman seen in her company on multiple occasions. Whether this so-called friendship was more than what was socially acceptable, we may never know, but sources close to the family claim the scandal has cast a long shadow over the household. Elena's stomach twisted. She flipped to another page, this time from 2 years later. The sudden disappearance of Eleanor Marsh has left many unanswered questions. Last seen near Ravenglen Manor, she was due to be married within the month, yet failed to appear for any of the planned ceremonies. While some believe she left town willingly, others whisper that tragedy struck before she could flee. No evidence has been found to confirm either theory. Eleanor Marsh. Elena's heart pounded as she reread the name. Lillian's letters had never mentioned Eleanor directly, but now, the pieces were falling into place. They had been in love, and something had torn them apart. But the biggest question remained: what had happened to Eleanor? The evening sky was tinged with violet by the time Elena returned to the hidden garden. The knowledge she now carried weighed heavily on her. She knelt by the stone marker, running her fingers over the worn letters. Had Lillian placed this here for Eleanor? Or for herself? The journal's final entry echoed in her mind. "I buried my heart here." Heart pounding, she reached for the shovel she had left by the gate. If something had been hidden beneath this earth, she had to know. The first few layers were soft, giving way easily. The scent of damp soil filled the air as she dug deeper, each movement fueled by the unanswered questions clawing at her thoughts. Then a hollow sound. Her breath caught. She scraped away the last layers of dirt until something solid emerged beneath her hands. A wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth, its surface warped with time. With careful hands, she pulled it free and unwrapped it. Inside she found a gold locket, its chain delicate and tarnished, with a tiny clasp that clicked open to reveal 2 miniature portraits, Lillian and Eleanor. A single pressed rose, dried and brittle, but still holding its shape. A letter, carefully folded, its edges worn but intact. Elena unfolded the letter, her hands trembling as she read the words written in Lillian's familiar, looping script. "Eleanor, if you ever return, this is where you will find me. If you can forgive me, if you still love me, you will know where to look. But if you are gone, truly gone, then I will bury my heart here, where we once dreamed of a life together. I will never love another. I will wait for you in the garden always. A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. Lillian had waited. Had Eleanor ever returned? Had she ever seen this letter? Or had she vanished without a trace, leaving Lillian alone with her grief? Elena pressed the letter to her chest, staring at the stone marker. Whatever had happened all those years ago, she knew one thing for certain. This garden held more than just memories. It held the remains of a love that had never been given a chance to flourish. And it had been waiting all this time for someone to uncover the truth. The night air was thick with silence as Elena sat cross-legged on the damp earth, the weight of the locket and letter resting in her lap. The flickering glow of her lantern cast long, wavering shadows over the hidden garden, its once-forgotten memorial stones standing solemnly before her. She traced the initials LH carved into the stone, her mind spinning with questions. Lillian had waited here for Eleanor, hoping she would return. But had she? Had Eleanor ever seen this letter? Had she ever come back? Or was she buried beneath this very soil? The thought sent a shiver through Elena's body. She wasn't sure if it was paranoia, exhaustion, or the weight of all she had uncovered, but something about the air in the garden felt different now, charged, expectant. Elena glanced at the hole she had already dug. She had found Lillian's letter, the locket, the pressed rose. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper. With a steadying breath, she reached for the shovel once more. The first few layers of soil were easy to turn, the scent of earth and decaying leaves rising into the air. She dug carefully, methodically, listening only to the rhythmic scrape of the shovel. Then the resistance. A hollow thud vibrated up the handle. Elena froze. Slowly, cautiously, she cleared away more soil, brushing the dirt away with her hands as she unearthed a large wooden box, much older and heavier than the one she had found before. The wood was cracked, warped from time, but still intact. This was it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she ran her fingers over the worn lid, brushing away the last traces of soil. There was no lock, no clasp, just a simple wooden top, nailed shut. She swallowed hard and wedged the tip of the shovel into the seam. With a soft crack, the wood split, the lid giving way beneath her efforts. She pried it open and gasped. Inside the box, wrapped carefully in a bundle of faded, crumbling fabric, was the unmistakable shape of a human skeleton. Elena's hands flew to her mouth. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared down at the remains buried beneath the garden. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The world around her tilted, blurred, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then, carefully, reverently, she reached out and pulled back the last pieces of fabric. Beneath the decay of time, she saw a ring, a delicate band still wrapped around one of the skeletal fingers. It was gold, inset with a tiny, pale blue gemstone. A wedding ring. Elena's vision swam. The truth settled over her like a crushing weight. Eleanor Marsh hadn't disappeared. She had never left Ravenglen Manor. The garden was silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for her to understand. The newspaper clippings had told a story of a woman who vanished without a trace. But that wasn't true. Eleanor had been here all along, buried beneath the very place she had once shared with Lillian. Elena exhaled, her breath shaking. Had it been an accident? Had Eleanor returned to the garden only to meet some terrible fate? Or had someone ensured that she never left? She had to know. Hands trembling, she pulled the old letter from her pocket, the one Lillian had left buried in the smaller box. She read the words again. If you ever return, this is where you will find me. But if you are gone, truly gone, then I will bury my heart here, where we once dreamed of a life together. Lillian had written those words in despair, thinking Eleanor had abandoned her. But what if? What if she had found out the truth? A new, terrible thought struck her. What if Lillian had buried Eleanor herself? The idea was horrifying. But the more Elena thought about it, the more the pieces fit. Lillian had never married, never moved away, never let anyone touch the garden. She had lived in Ravenglen Manor until the day she died, alone. Had she been keeping a secret all this time? Had she buried Eleanor here, not as an act of violence, but of love? Had she protected this grave because she knew no one would understand? Elena let out a slow, unsteady breath. This wasn't just a story of lost love. This was a tragedy that had played out in silence, in the shadows of a society that would never accept them. Lillian and Eleanor had never been given a chance. And now, at last, Elena had uncovered the truth. The sky was beginning to lighten when she finally moved from her place beside the grave. She wiped the dirt from her hands and stood, looking down at the remains one last time. "I found you," she whispered. "I know what happened." The wind stirred the leaves around her, a soft sigh that felt almost like an answer. She knew what she had to do next. She had to give Eleanor the peace she had been denied. And she had to make sure that Lillian's story, their story, was finally told. The morning sun broke through the trees, casting long golden rays across the garden. For the first time since arriving at Ravenglen Manor, Elena felt the weight of the place shift, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally uncover the truth. She had barely slept. After unearthing Eleanor's remains, she had sat in the garden for hours, struggling with what to do next. The discovery wasn't just a personal revelation, it was history, something bigger than herself. Lillian and Eleanor's story had been buried along with them. But now, it wouldn't stay hidden anymore. Elena made her way into town just as the shops were opening, heading straight for the police station. The officers listened as she explained what she had found, their initial skepticism giving way to quiet astonishment when she mentioned Eleanor Marsh's disappearance. A formal investigation was launched. Forensic teams arrived at Ravenglen Manor later that day, setting up in the hidden garden. Elena stood back, watching as they carefully exhumed the remains, documenting everything. One of the investigators, a woman with a kind but serious face, approached her afterward. "Given how long ago this happened, there's no way to determine the exact cause of death," she admitted. "But based on the placement of the remains, it doesn't look like foul play." Elena's chest tightened. Then, she wasn't murdered? The investigator hesitated. "It's possible she fell. Maybe an accident or an illness. The soil around her suggests she was placed there carefully, not hastily." Elena let out a shaky breath. Lillian hadn't killed Eleanor. She had simply buried the person she loved. The police confirmed Eleanor's identity, matching old dental records and personal belongings with the town archives. Over the next few days, news of the discovery spread quickly. Articles appeared in local newspapers, recounting the once-forgotten love story between Lillian and Eleanor. People who had never known the truth now spoke about it in hushed voices, some in awe, some in sadness, some in quiet respect. Ravenglen Manor's greatest mystery had finally been unearthed. But there was still one last thing to do. Elena didn't want Eleanor's final resting place to be a hidden grave. She wanted to give both her and Lillian the peace they had been denied in life. The town council agreed to allow a proper burial for Eleanor, with a headstone placed in the local cemetery next to an empty plot where Lillian had been laid to rest decades before. At the small service held in their honor, Elena stood among the few who had gathered, reading aloud from Lillian's journal. "This garden belongs to us, and no matter what happens, it will always hold our secret." She looked down at the locket she had found in the grave, still nestled in her palm. She had cleaned it, polished it, restored its shine. The delicate portraits of Lillian and Eleanor stared back at her, side by side, finally together again. Elena left the locket at the base of Eleanor's headstone, where it belonged. And for the first time since she had arrived at Ravenglen Manor, she felt something in the air shift. Not just relief. Not just resolution. Peace. Though the mystery had been solved, Elena wasn't finished yet. She stayed at Ravenglen Manor, dedicating the following weeks to restoring the hidden garden. She trimmed back the wild vines, uncovered the stone pathways, and replanted the rose bushes that had once lined the gate. She carefully cleaned the old memorial stone, replacing the initials LH with something new, something complete. Lillian Hawthorne and Eleanor Marsh. In a world that could not hold their love, they found eternity in each other. As she worked, the house felt different. The heavy air, the lingering sense of unfinished business, it was gone. The creaking in the halls no longer felt like whispers of the past. The distant sound of rustling leaves no longer sent shivers down her spine. The house was just a house now. The garden was just a garden. And Elena knew that Lillian and Eleanor had finally found their way home. That evening, as she sat on the garden bench, watching the wind dance through the willow trees, she swore she saw them, two shadowy figures, standing beneath the branches, hand in hand. Elena smiled. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures.